Emperor Alexander II of Russia was born in April 1818. He became the Russian Tsar or Tsar or Char or Emperor when his father Nicholas I died in March 1855. In other words, Alexander II was 36 years old. He had received a varied education which included the knowledge of, in addition to his native Russian, of course, German, French, and English. While he definitely wanted to remain an autocrat, in other words, to have no official limitations or competing powers that would deprive him of officially unlimited power, he wanted to rule according to the laws. He realized that Russia, which had clearly fallen behind the other major European powers, especially Britain and France, in terms of industrialization and even in terms of military efficiency, as was being proved at the time of his accession to power by Russia's humiliating defeats to Britain and France in the Crimean War. He decided to reform Russia from above so as to make it a clearly more efficient, clearly more modernized or modernizing, and at last industrializing empire. He decided in 1861, at last, and probably several decades later than it should have happened, to abolish serfdom, the system whereby tens of millions of Russian peasants were their landowners, usually rich Russian aristocrats' property. They could not even get married without the landlord's approval, let alone visit other villages or towns or cities. And traveling abroad, of course, was forbidden. But then again, it would have been beyond their financial means, at least for a great majority of them, even if they had been free peasants. The voluntary freeing of peasants had been instituted, possibly by Alexander I's grandfather, Alexander II's, grandfather Alexander I, who had that liberal period roughly in the first decade of the 19th century and at the start of the second one, which then ended when Napoleon, with his Grande Armée or Great Army, composed of soldiers from several or many European nations, invaded Russia in 1812, although that invasion then was unsuccessful. So that reform happened in 1861. However, the serfs did not even receive all of the land that they had been farming, according to probably already late or deceased Russian-American historian Nicholas Ryasanovsky. They received 18%, in other words, over 1/6 less land than they had been farming. Besides, the aristocrats, their former landowners, could choose which lands to give to the peasants. And besides, the lands were not until Prime Minister Stolypin's agricultural reform starting in around 1906, the lands were not given directly to the peasants, but rather to the village communities or communes called mir in Russian. And this meant, of course, that the system of primitive and inefficient agriculture largely continued. And then, especially if the villages were densely populated, as they were in the western areas of Russian Empire and also various southern areas. Here I'm talking about the Ukraine, for example. It meant then that the individual peasants had fairly little land to farm, and given their primitive agricultural tools and methods, it was difficult for them to eke out, even in good years, any significant surplus by farming. Secondly, Alexander II reformed the Russian courts and at last instituted the principle of equality before the law. He then reformed the Russian local and regional administration so that the so-called Zemstvo boards were created, which had a limited right to tax. In other words, Russia started to have regular municipal and regional elections. However, there were no directly elected provincial legislatures, although a few areas such as Estonia, Livonia, and then Finland had indirectly elected legislatures. And tragically, Alexander II was killed on the very day when he considered signing the so-called Loris Melikov or Melnikov constitution or constitutional proposal, which would have established two indirectly elected legislative commissions. So Russia would have had some sort of equivalent of a national parliament. However, since they would have been indirectly elected legislative assemblies or commissions, it is doubtful how much effective power they would have had. And then finally, in the 1870s, Alexander II ended the brutal and inhumane system whereby those people, often peasants, or normally peasants, and in a lamentable number of cases Jews, sometimes also other ethnic minorities, but mostly Russian peasants, were drafted or conscripted into the Russian army to serve there for 25 years. And for many of the recruits, given already the low or the short average lifespan, and then those at times frequent wars that Russia got into, and then the poor sanitary conditions in the army, this meant that many of those soldiers never returned home. The length of military service was reduced to 6 years, which was still, of course, long, but at least it was only about 1/4 of the military service's original length. Despite these reforms, and ironically partly because of them, he was a target of several assassination attempts between 1866 and 1880. In 1880, the conspirators got as far as the actual Winter Palace, where the Tsar or Emperor lived with his family in St. Petersburg. That was then the Russian imperial capital. And if he and his family had come to dinner on time, because they were waiting for the Prince of Bulgaria, which was then a principality, a self-governing principality in southeastern Europe, and would become independent later, still in the late 19th century. If they had all been on time, they would all have been killed, because tens of servants of the imperial family were either killed or wounded as a result of the explosion. And then there was later in 1880 an attempt to blow up the train on which the emperor had been traveling, but either the bomb failed to detonate, or then the conspirators didn't manage to plant the bomb on the right train. Yeah, probably the first explanation was the correct one. But finally then, On March the 1st, 1881, according to the old Julian calendar or the old style, or on March the 13th, 1881, according to the Gregorian calendar or the new style, Emperor Alexander II, aged 62, made that usual Sunday tour in St. Petersburg, starting from the Winter Palace, to be present in the capital's soldiers' roll call. There were at least 4 conspirators planted or positioned on the route. This comes from a YouTube video on the assassination. One of them threw his bomb or grenade. It did explode, however, it only damaged the Tsar's steel carriage. That was a gift from Emperor Napoleon III of France, by the way. The Tsar was shocked by the explosion, but yet unhurt. At least 2 people were killed by the first explosion, and contrary to the wise advice of some or several people who stood nearby, the Tsar decided to get out of his carriage to inquire how the wounded were doing. And this was what another conspirator had been waiting for, and he threw the second bomb or grenade at the Tsar's feet, with the result that they were shattered and or blown off. His stomach was ripped open, and he was also otherwise badly wounded. According to the Russian Wikipedia on the assassination, the successful assassination attempt, he whispered, "Take me back to the palace to die there." He was carried back to the palace. He lived long enough to receive the Russian Orthodox Church's last rites, absolution, and the Holy Communion, and he died shortly thereafter, on that afternoon. And many people throughout the Russian Empire, including my distant native land, Finland, in Northern Europe, that was then a self-governing Grand Duchy under the Russian Empire, mourned or grieved for his death. And at least some historians have theorized that had Alexander II lived long enough to die of natural causes later in the late 19th century, or perhaps in the early years of the 20th century, because he was in good health before his assassination, then Russia could potentially have escaped the brutal revolutions of 1917, first the so-called bourgeois one, and then the much bloodier Bolshevik one in March and November 1917 respectively, although because of the old Julian calendar they have been called traditionally the February and October revolutions. However, it remains doubtful whether Alexander II would have wanted to establish an elected national parliament, or at the very least a national parliament for Russia that would have contained a directly elected lower house, and then an indirectly elected and or appointed upper house. As it turned out, only his grandson, Nicholas II, who was incidentally Russia's last Tsar or emperor, reluctantly instituted a 2-chamber imperial or national parliament, where the lower house was at first, in 1906, mostly directly elected, albeit from different social classes, and the women were excluded. But then in the subsequent elections, the right to vote was so distorted that the landowning aristocrats, who composed over 1% of Russia's population, were guaranteed 50% of the lower houses or Duma's seats. And the upper house was partly appointed by the emperor, partly indirectly elected by some or several institutions. So it remains a point of historical contention and debate whether Alexander II would, in his last years, if he had been allowed to die in peace of an advanced old age, have liberalized Russia at least to some extent, and would then have incidentally made unnecessary the reaction under his son Alexander III. Of course, if Alexander II had not been assassinated and had lived to full years, it is possible that Alexander III would never have taken office because he died of, or ascended the Russian throne because he died of nephritis, a kidney condition, already in 1894. And then Nicholas II's reign would have been possibly shorter. But Nicholas II was not especially brilliant. He also was notably conservative, even reactionary and fatalist. And it took him often a long time to make important decisions. Alexander III was a lot more decisive than his son and successor. However, he was notably, if not radically, conservative, and rolled back to some extent his father's reforms, even though his father had retained the title of autocrat and had not instituted a national parliament for Russia. Okay, see you again.